For 6 years in the 1990s, I was a White House correspondent for Newsday of Long Island. I was privileged to ride Air Force One some 20 times, usually in the windowless bulkhead seat you see on the left here in the press cabin of today, the seat assigned to the newspaper reporter in the small rotating travel pool. I have souvenirs, this certificate, and these free presidential M&Ms. And out of nostalgia, I'm going to explore with you the evolution of presidential travel.
President George Washington never traveled faster than a horse could gallop, and his stately official carriage was a lot slower than that. Andrew Jackson in 1833 was the first president to upgrade to train travel, taking a 40-mile B&O railroad outing to Baltimore. In 1899, William McKinley became first president to ride in a car, a locomobile. Bold Teddy Roosevelt, a year past his presidency in 1910, naturally was the first who had held the office to fly. On a 4-minute jaunt in a flimsy Wright Brothers flyer at a Missouri county fair, TR took his hand off the strut to wave to the crowd and almost fell off the plane. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt arrived in 1933, the Navy based a Douglas Dolphin amphibian for him on the Potomac River, but FDR never used it, preferring trains and ships. Roosevelt eventually made the first presidential flight in January 1943. He took off in Pan Am's Dixie Clipper, a Boeing 314, secretly bound from Miami to South America and across to Africa. In an Army C-54, Roosevelt landed in Morocco for a wartime conference.
At this West African port fronting the Atlantic Ocean arrives President Roosevelt for his conference with Prime Minister Churchill. He drives in a scout car after having flown across the ocean. It is the first time that he has flown since becoming American president, and he is the only president to travel in a plane while in office.
On the way home, Roosevelt talked with Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower and with Admiral William Leahy, Roosevelt's sourpuss chief of staff. FDR cut the cake to celebrate his 61st birthday in the air. The Army Air Corps offered Roosevelt a C-87A personal plane called the Guess Where To, a VIP variant of the B-24 Liberator bomber. The Secret Service rejected the aircraft because of the B-24's poor safety record. But that C-87 was considered good enough to fly Eleanor Roosevelt through Central and South America on a 1944 Goodwill trip. First presidential plane was the Sacred Cow, a special C-54, or DC-4, with an elevator to hoist FDR in his wheelchair. Roosevelt made just one round trip in the plane, from Malta to Yalta in the Soviet Crimea to confer with Churchill and Stalin in February 1945, then back to his Navy cruiser at Cairo. 2 months later, Roosevelt was dead. Successor Harry S. Truman, whom I met at UCLA in 1960, loved to ride the 15-passenger, 250-mile-per-hour Sacred Cow, although it was unpressurized. He generously lent it to his Secretary of State, to Churchill, to almost anyone who asked. 1947. Truman upgraded to the Independence, a 328-mile-an-hour Douglas DC-6 named for his Missouri hometown. The 25-passenger transport got a patriotic but weird paint job on the nose, the head of an American bald eagle. In 1948, the recently created U.S. Air Force bought a Lockheed Constellation for White House use. Truman got word that the Pentagon had code-named the new plane Dewdrop, expecting its occupant to be the widely favored Republican candidate Thomas E. Dewey. Truman beat Dewey in an upset and snubbed the Constellation. In fact, Truman puckishly ordered a Dewey-style mustache cup installed in the cockpit of what became Independence's backup plane. Truman and his daughter Margaret stuck with the Independence. The president flew in 1951 to Wake Island in the Pacific to talk Korean War strategy with General Douglas MacArthur, soon fired for insubordination by the feisty president. Ike Eisenhower was inaugurated in 1953, taking delivery of a converted VC-121A Constellation he dubbed Columbine II, after the state flower of Mamie Eisenhower's adopted home state, Colorado. No Columbine I? Well, that was Ike's plane as NATO's supreme commander in Europe. Columbine II could lift 33 passengers up to 5,500 miles at 354 miles per hour. Guests included the young Queen Elizabeth II, Vice President Richard Nixon, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. One day in 1953, Eisenhower was flying over New York City when air controllers mixed up Columbine's call sign, the tail number ending in 610, with nearby Eastern Airlines Flight 610. Shocked by the near collision, Columbine pilot Bill Draper suggested Air Force One as the call sign for any Air Force plane with the president aboard. The concept was adopted, but not until 1959. November 1954 brought the larger, faster Columbine III, a sleek Super Connie that could fly 44 passengers at 376 miles an hour. Mamie christened the plane with water from Colorado. Columbine III took the president to Geneva in 1955 for the first post-war U.S.-Soviet summit with Nikita Khrushchev.
There's something smaller but also new in planes for President Eisenhower, who's trying out a twin-engine Aero Commander for a trip from Washington to his farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It's the first time a president has flown in a plane with less than 4 engines, but the pilot contends it's safer than bucking automobile traffic.
1959. Presidential flight went from propellers to the jet age as Eisenhower took Queenie, one of 3 military VIP 707s, to 11 nations on his flight to peace. The successful trip covered 22,000 miles in 19 days. President John F. Kennedy, whom I met several times and photographed in New York, was used to a personal airplane. His father, Joseph Kennedy, had gifted the family with the Caroline, a second-hand Convair 240 named for JFK's daughter. Wife Jackie and Senator Kennedy campaigned in the Caroline in 1960, triumphantly. Summer 1961. While I watched tensely from afar as a soldier at Fort Ord, California, Kennedy rode one of the original 40-passenger 707s to Vienna for a summit with Khrushchev that did not go well, leading to Soviet construction of the Berlin Wall. Now we're talking about a historic aircraft known by millions worldwide, the 48-passenger Special Air Mission 26,000, delivered to Kennedy in 1962. Jackie Kennedy enlisted industrial designer Raymond Loewy to create the distinctive blue and white gold-striped Air Force One color scheme, carried on ever since. Summer 1963. Kennedy traveled on 26,000 to West Berlin for an important Cold War speech.
Today, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast is, Ich bin ein Berliner.
That November, the President and First Lady flew to Texas to help squabbling local Democrats mend political fences. Kennedy's last flight, the short hop from Fort Worth to Dallas on the morning of November 22nd.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade group.
To reassure a reeling nation, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson had himself sworn in as president on Air Force One on the ground in Dallas. With Kennedy's casket boarded, the jet lifted off for Washington, an unforgettable days of sadness. $26,000 executed a mournful flyover of the graveside services at Arlington, gunning its 4 engines in tribute. LBJ made $26,000 his own, once flying to South Vietnam to discuss the war with Army General William Westmoreland. When Johnson flew from an Austin, Texas air base to his LBJ ranch, a small VC-6A Beechcraft King Air turned into Air Force One. Also Air Force One on occasion under LBJ was a Lockheed Jetstar. Nixon took command. Aboard 26,000, he and Pat Nixon made their stunning, world-changing trip to Beijing in the People's Republic of China in February 1972. $26,000 served for 36 years, flying 8 presidents from Kennedy to Bill Clinton. Monica Lewinsky once rode the great ship to Europe as a Pentagon staffer, pre-White House. December 1972. Re-elected, Nixon inaugurated a second cramped 707, even though roomier Boeing 747s had been flying airline routes since 1970. SAM 27,000 seated 50, ranged up to 7,140 miles, and could hit 627 miles an hour. Nixon named the plane the Spirit of 76. When Nixon resigned in 1974 in the Watergate scandal, the Spirit of 76 flew him home to California.
As I step off the Spirit of 76, this great plane that took us to China, to Russia on 2 occasions, to the Mideast, this great Spirit of 76 is one that we will always remember because of those trips.
In some ways, 27,000 proved an unlucky plane for President Gerald Ford. During his 28 months as chief executive, he was shot at twice in California, once by a Manson family member, and he became known, fairly or not, for pratfalls.
I had an umbrella in one hand, and I was trying to hold Betty's arm with my other hand. And inadvertently, I tripped and took a bad spill.
Jimmy and Rosalind Carter of Georgia were the centers of attention on 26,000 and 27,000 from 1977 to 1981.
I felt quite at home on Air Force One, and always felt when I was there that I was not isolated up in the sky somewhere, but had direct access to members of the Congress, to friendly leaders of nations, and in case of an emergency that I could talk to the Kremlin or to any other place.
For Newsweek, I spent more than a year on Ronald Reagan's 1980 campaign planes, but I did not move to Washington nor ride on Air Force One, not for 11 years. Meanwhile, President Reagan made himself comfortable on the 2 707s.
It's kind of your private turf.
Nancy Reagan continued her endearing campaign habit of bowling an orange down the center aisle as Air Force One rose on takeoff.
It's a better office than any I have. I can get more done on this plane.
Although Reagan and his staff used every inch of the obsolescent 707s, the White House plainly needed something bigger. In 1985, bigger planes were ordered, but a year-and-a-half's construction delay prevented Reagan from experiencing as president what would emerge as the most famous Air Force One of them all.
my plane.
George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush in 1990 had the pleasure of being first customers aboard SAM 28000 and its identical backup, tail number 29000. Maintained by the 89th Airlift Wing at Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington, the 76-passenger 747s, or VC-25As, set world standards in communications and technology, though they don't have the escape pod Harrison Ford uses in the movie. They do offer twin beds for the first couple and a private shower.
I think people say ostentatious in the sense that it's a 747 for one person, the President of the United States, but I'm never alone in this job. And secondly, it's common sense, desks, and there are some good communications, and the telephone system is great.
Well, this is where I come in. In June 1991, I finally got to D.C. and started covering President Bush. Air Force One has 14 press cabin seats far aft on the starboard side. For each flight leg, news organizations rotate in alphabetically, pooling reports and pictures with those on the press charter. The port side is blocked off by a bulkhead, beyond which ride Secret Service agents with an arsenal of weaponry. In late 1991, Bush went to Australia and Asia for 12 days, and I went along. The press schedule assigned me to switch from the TWA press charter to Air Force One at Honolulu's Hickam Air Force Base for the long hop to Sydney. I boarded Air Force One for the first time. Though my seat, not shown here, may have lacked a view, there was a monitor for watching movies, plenty of time to write, and a clunky government word processor for writing pool reports distributed by White House staff. As a courtesy at each seat, a description of the coming flight. While a forward galley dispensed gourmet food and wines for the honored guests up front, a tiny second galley behind the press seats served the journalists some horrible bologna sandwiches and potato chips. Not that anyone complained. Six days later, my next Air Force One rotation came up for the 8-hour leg between Singapore and Seoul, South Korea. Landing in the wintry chill, I watched the first couple lay a wreath at the Korean War Memorial. That's me in the red scarf taking notes for the pool report. In Tokyo, we got a scare and a story. Bush collapsed with the 24-hour stomach flu, barfing on the lap of Prime Minister Kiichi Miyazawa.
The lone camera in the dining room was locked in on the head table when President Bush was overcome by nausea and fell forward. It appears he lost consciousness as he toppled over onto his host, Prime Minister Miyazawa.
That June of 1992, I was in the main square of Panama's capital with Bush when he ran into an angry protest by supporters of the former President Manuel Noriega, ousted and imprisoned in Bush's invasion of the country a year earlier. Whiffing police tear gas, Bush was forced to ditch his triumphal speech, and all of us fled for the airport. In darkness over the Amazon, I dictated the story to my editors via Air Force One's radio telephone on the pool leg down to Rio. There, Bush, up for re-election and spooked by the conservative Republican base, grudgingly and briefly attended the first United Nations Summit on the Environment. That fall, I flew on crowded old 27,000 as Air Force One when Bush campaigned in Tennessee. On the 747s, I made campaign flights to Chicago, Dallas, Southern California, the Pacific Northwest, Michigan, New Jersey, Cleveland, Boston. On the trail, Bush, like other presidents, often used the plush presidential helicopter Marine One, known to the Secret Service as a White Top. It's a Sikorsky VH-3D Sea King or a VH-60N White Hawk. The media entourage tags along in ordinary Marine choppers. For us reporters, sometimes they were powerful sea stallions, but more often they were oil-dripping Vietnam-era CH-46 Sea Knights, or Chinooks. Conditions on the workhorse helicopters were noisy, dim, and bare bones, but this one blonde guy, Jay Carney of Time magazine, apparently liked that life so much in the 1990s that he later became President Barack Obama's White House press secretary. Helicopter travel began with Eisenhower. Back in 1957, he risked flying in a two-seat Bell 47 between the White House, Camp David, and his Gettysburg farm. Now it's routine, presidents coming and going from the White House South Lawn to Andrews, where Air Force One is fueled and ready. Bill Clinton was the second president I traveled with far back on Air Force One. After laboring on deadline with Press Secretary Mike McCurry, I relaxed for a Christmas 1995 photo with Bill and Hillary Clinton and with my future wife, Irma Hawkins. When runways were too short for the bigger planes, Clinton turned an executive Gulfstream or even a Learjet into Air Force One. On one 1995 Clinton trip, I was booked on Air Force One to the Atlanta area. At the Andrews Press Center, the Air Force One and charter passengers checked in. Advance man Josh King arrived bearing the presidential seal. Secret Service agents went through our gear. We walked out to the waiting presidential jumbo jet. A press cabin digital clock indicated that Washington and Atlanta were in the same time zone. Helicopters flew the White House party from a Marietta Air Base to the Georgia Dome parking lot. Clinton and Vice President Al Gore encouraged the planners of the coming 1996 Atlanta Summer Olympic Games. Clinton overnighted at the Georgia governor's mansion. Next day, we were in Tallahassee, where the president addressed Florida legislators. I got to play governor in an empty hearing room. A year later, at New York's JFK Airport, Clinton was consoling families of passengers killed in the TWA 800 air disaster off Long Island. From there, Clinton flew with daughter Chelsea to the Atlanta Olympics for a night of gymnastics and swimming. My seatmate was author George Plimpton. While the 1996 Republican convention was nominating Bob Dole to oppose Clinton, the first family vacationed in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, choppering from the Grand Tetons north to Yellowstone for a presidential speech on the environment. On pool duty, I found myself short of water on a grueling 8-mile backcountry hike with Bill, Hillary, and Chelsea. I spent a few days with Dole's ill-fated campaign, ending 1996 on a DC-9 designated Air Force One that took Clinton to the Army-Navy game in Philadelphia. In 2000, no longer at the White House, I spent the fall months for USA Today on Republican vice presidential candidate Dick Cheney's campaign plane based in Jackson, Wyoming. The Supreme Court awarded running mate George W. Bush the presidency and Air Force One. Each 747, 231 feet in length, has 85 phones, 57 antennas, 19 TV monitors, and a range of nearly 10,000 miles, not counting aerial refueling.
This is a flying family. The people on this airplane work hard to accommodate the president and his party. They are gracious, they are fun to be with, and it was an honor to serve with them.
For his controversial May 2003 speech at sea aboard the carrier Lincoln, claiming mission accomplished in Iraq, Bush arrived in the co-pilot seat of an S-3B Viking, call signed Navy One. First time that ever happened. In 2004, I covered Bush's Democratic challengers John Kerry and John Edwards as they tried to qualify for Air Force One. They fell short, but 4 years later, Barack Obama made it. Nearing the end of their service life, the current 747-200s will be replaced in a few years by two new modified Boeing 747-8s, longer and with better engines. There was also an Air Force Two, a Boeing 757 for the Vice President. I flew with Gore on one trip, Cheney and then Joe Biden gaining use of the aircraft in later years. Donald Trump boasts his own 757, but there's no comparison with the workaday Air Force Two. In fact, giving up his twin-engine Hair Force One for Air Force One would be a come-down for the Republican presidential candidate. For sheer ostentation, the Trump plane outdoes the ride of any Arabian Gulf oil state monarch.
Hi, I'm Amanda Miller, and I'm standing inside Mr. Trump's luxurious new 757. Mr. Trump's new plane fits 43 passengers. You'll notice the seat belts, as well as everything else, are 24-karat gold plated. This is the dining area. This is the main lounge featuring the Sky Theater system. It features a 57-inch screen and the sound system of a top Hollywood screening room. Mr. Trump's bedroom has yards and yards of elegant gold silk adorning the cabin walls. The master bathroom with a shower and 24-karat gold-plated sink.
Whoever the winner of the 2016 election, it is inspiring to know that most past presidential airplanes are not lost to history. The Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, houses the carefully restored Sacred Cow of Roosevelt and Truman. Also on display in the museum's presidential gallery, Truman's gleaming Independence, Eisenhower's beautiful Columbine III, and above all, the 707 known as 26,000, so inextricably associated with the tragedy of John Fitzgerald Kennedy in Dallas and the Nixon journey to China. 27,000 has become a hugely popular attraction at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California. Even Columbine II, sold by the government long ago to a private buyer and left to deteriorate for years in the Arizona desert, has been flown east for restoration in Virginia by new owner Carl Stoltzfus. The helicopter from which Richard Nixon waved farewell to the White House is viewable at the Nixon Library in Whittier, California, where I had some fun with it in 2007, along with library director Tim Naftali. I'll never forget all those flights with all their security badges and those potato chips back in the 90s. Most professionally exciting were the rare times a president strolled all the way back to the press cabin to chat with his travel pool.
For me, those were hectic but great days, observing history close up. But do I miss it? The pre-dawn drives out to Andrews, the long flights, the sometimes sorry food we got in steerage at the back of the plane? You're darn right I miss it, and I would do it again tomorrow, just to be aboard Air Force One. Magnificent flying symbol of America.